CVSS scores actually do something that's pretty amazing, and they allow you to compare. They allow you to compare the severity of a vulnerability across multiple platforms, which is great. Something that hadn't happened before CVS was around. So you never knew, hey, this vulnerability in this Adobe product, how does that compare to this vulnerability in Oracle? It gave us a common language to speak with. What CVSS doesn't do, and which it's unfortunately being used as today, is it doesn't actually express risk. It looks like it expresses risk, right? If you look at it really from like a 5,000 foot view, it looks like, oh, well, this is a remote code execution. So clearly that's a higher risk than something that's an elevation of privilege. But there's actually a lot more that goes into what constitutes the risk of a vulnerability. And that's really where CVS falls short. But we're using CVSS as a risk score because for a lot of organizations, that's the only measurement they have for a vulnerability. And so they have to use it as a risk score. And that's really where we start to get into trouble with CVSS as our only tooling for measuring vulnerability.
You talked, Alan, about it's not a risk score. I actually think maybe it's being used as the entire calculation as opposed to what I think it was originally intended for, and that is a part of a calculation. And unfortunately, people get busy, so they use what they have, and it does default to being how do they organize or sort the things that they have to do.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, if you have two vulnerabilities, let's say you have a vulnerability in Microsoft Exchange and a vulnerability in Squirrel Mail, and both of those have CVSS scores of 9. Generally speaking, the vulnerability on Exchange is going to be much more critical because it's going to impact more people than Squirrel Mail will. Now, in your organization, that calculus may change. You may have invested heavily in Squirrel Mail, and that is what you're using across your entire environment. And so then that becomes a much more critical risk to you. So I think having that as an isolated number doesn't help if you don't know what your own situational awareness is, what your own risk is, as well as what kind of other protections you have in place.
And I think this is a really a salient point we need to drive home is that this conversation is not whether CVSS is good or bad. CVSS is very good, but take it for what it is. It is a vulnerability snapshot, right, without the context of your organization. So how could they know what's happening in the organization? So they do the best they can, taking into consideration the commonality across industries, and then provide you that severity rating, et cetera, to work with. But the next step is really to consider what is the organizational context.